Hi everyone. Today we look at the implementation of lists and tables in HTML. We have already actually used lists on a couple of occasions, but today we're going to summarize the syntax for all types of lists that exist in web programming. We can have unordered lists, which are generally referred to as bulleted lists. We can have ordered lists, which are numbered, and we can have definition lists that work kind of like unordered lists, except that your bullets are replaced with terms, and for each term we have a definition. So we'll see some good examples of when this could actually be a very useful tool. The syntax for the first type of list, the unordered list, is just a pair of UL tags, an opening and a closing one, and then each individual item is going to show up as a list item in between those tags, an opening li and a closing li. Here's a quick example of some of the days of the week being displayed in the form of an unordered bulleted list. Do note that you can, as part of a list, you could have just about anything. You can have an entire paragraph, you can have images, you can have links, or what you're seeing here in this example is you can have another unordered list. So after the Wednesday list item, we have a second unordered list, which is nested within the first one, which has its own list items. And in order to set it apart from the first one, we are customizing the style of that second unordered list in the following manner. We set the bullets to look like hollow circles. The way we do that is with the list style type attribute value for the style attribute, and we set that to circle. What you're seeing here on this next slide is an example of one and the same list being displayed using different styles. So just keep in mind you can accomplish just about anything with CSS in terms of styling. So the HTML here for these four lists is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is just the CSS styling, and you can see how varied and different they are from each other. Again, HTML is the same, but they look quite different on the screen. Ordered lists, we've used those as well. They're very similar to unordered lists. The exception is that now instead of bullets, we're using numbers to number the individual items. To create an ordered list, we're going to use the OL tags, an opening and a closing one, and then the items in between those two are going to show up again with the list item tags, an opening and a closing for each item. And here's a quick example of an ordered list. So starting with the first one, you can see how the numbers change. They go from 1 through 6. A definition list, another name for this is a glossary list. The definition list is helpful whenever you want to use terms instead of just regular bullets. So for each individual item, you're going to have the name of the item, which is going to be your definition term, and then what shows up after it. That will be the definition for that term. Okay. So with the previous two types of lists, we only use two pairs of tags. The one that defines the entire list and the one for each list item. Now here we're using three types of tag pairs. We have the overall DL for the definition list, then for each one of the items we have the DT tags, and then for the text that comes after or the term, we're going to use the DD tags for the definition of those terms. And here's an example. We're going to see what it looks like, what this looks like on the screen in just a moment. We're setting it up with the DL tags. Then in there we got three different terms, and for each and every one of those terms we have a definition. And here's what it could look like on the screen. Alright. Remember that you can always nest individual elements, and when you do, the rule of thumb is that you want the element you want to close first is the one you opened last. So what you're seeing here is we are bolding some of the text, and the correct way to do that in between those DT tags is to ensure that the strong tags are open and closed. And here's what that web page from the previous slide is going to look like on the screen. Changing bullets and numbering with the use of the list style type, we get to customize the way the bullets look or the ways the numbers are displayed. For ordered lists, you can switch to Roman numerals, to letters, along with several other numbering schemes. And you can see here the keywords to be used. For the unordered list with the bullets, you can change the shape of that bullet to a square or an open circle, or you can even use your own image with the help of the list style image attribute value, or remove the bullet altogether if you set the list style type to equal none. And that summarizes everything we need to know about lists in HTML. Now we're ready to switch our attention to tables. Alright, tables we haven't seen yet, so this is the first time we're seeing tables. They're really useful whenever you need to display tabular material that can be arranged into rows and columns. I'm sure you've worked with tables before. Today we get to see what the correct syntax is for defining and displaying tables in web development. The second really big use for tables in HTML is to help you format the way that your elements look on the screen. Now this is no longer as popular as it used to be. Today people use CSS for that. However, 15-20 years ago, this was the way to actually form the outlook and the layout of your web pages. People used to use tables, and we're going to see how that's done. It's still popular with some web designers. I use that quite often myself as well. A couple of quick examples of tables. Here's one set of data that's going to be well displayed in the form of a table, and here's another one. This one is a timetable for the railway, I think. But there are numerous examples on the web, so this was just a quick view of when tables could come in handy. And as I just mentioned, tables may be used to help you with the layout of your web page. What you're seeing here is presumably set up with the help of a table. Now you can do this really easily with CSS as well. We're going to spend an entire week, actually 2 weeks, talking about layout, columns, and things like that. But as you shall see today, you can easily set this up with the help of a table as well. The table can have invisible borders, so users who don't look at your HTML code will never know you're actually using a table. So the table is only there to help you outline the look of your page, the layout of your page, but people don't actually get to see this as a table. They don't know that there's a table lying underneath what's being displayed on the screen. So what is a table? Tables are going to be made up of rows and columns, and the intersection of a row with a column is going to be called a cell. So please remember this terminology. I'll be using this quite often when we need to know what we're referring to. And we're going to have tags to create the table, to create the rows, and then to create the cell data within each row. Alright, so once we know what our table looks like, we're going to split it up into rows and columns, and we'll add the syntax or the elements that help us create that table within our web page. So the first thing we need to know is the table element. This is what creates a table. It's still in what we're seeing here is still just a blank table, nothing in it. We still need to actually create each row separately, and to do that we use the tr tags. So tr creates a new row in a table. If you want to have 3 rows, here's the way to do it. So in between your table tags, you're going to set up 3 rows that you can use for whatever purpose you need them. Now once you have those rows, you're going to start creating the cells, and this is essentially how the columns come to be. So for each, if you need to have 3 columns in your table, you're going to have 3 sets of TD tags or data tags within each one of your rows. You may create a heading if you want that with the help of the TH tags. What's so special about the heading? You don't have to have one, it's just an optional thing that you may wish to consider including. The heading really just automatically makes the data in that cell appear bolded and center aligned. So that's what a heading is. There's nothing special to it. Alright, so here's an example of a table that creates, what is it, 1, 2, 3 rows, and in the first row it's got a table heading. This thing supposedly will show up bold-faced and centered, and then in the second and third row it only has a line of text. Okay, so 1 column here, 3 rows. The very first row or the very first cell of that table has been formatted as a heading. Do remember that table cells can be assigned their own individual background colors, types of fonts, alignments. Pretty much everything you can customize with CSS can be done on an individual basis for each one of your cells. Also do note that, well, you've already noticed that by now, the information for the table is entered row by row going from left to right, and that is always the case. Okay. This could show up as a question on a test. Again, do remember when you're constructing your tables, you create them row by row and you go from left to right. There is no other option with that. Another example of a table, this time we see the tags. The previous one that we saw didn't have any tags. So in between the table elements we got how many? 3 rows. And because there's an individual data item, there's 3 individual data items for each row, then we must have 3 columns as well. The items displayed within the first row will be all bold-faced and centered. Captions. Captions are different than headings. They allow you to create kind of like a title for your table. Again, another thing that's not mandatory. You don't have to have it if you don't want it, but it gives you, the caption tag gives you the option to create what looks like a caption or a title for your table. And here's the syntax. It will show up before your first row. It's not part of any row. Please remember that. So table caption, at least in this example, kind of looks like that heading that we just saw in the previous example, but it's not just a regular heading, it's a caption for the entire table, and it's not part of any row. It's got to be the first thing that shows up in the definition of your table, and then you get to create all the rows. Borders. By default, borders have a thickness of 0. They're still there, but you don't really get to see them. So if you'd like to see them, if you'd like to have them, you can either use the HTML attribute border and set that to, like in this case, 1 for 1 pixel, or better yet, you can use CSS to set up the styling for your table. But this works as well. So if you wanted to set up the border of your table, it's really a great idea to do this while you're constructing your table, because without it you don't actually get to see the borders, and it's sometimes hard to tell whether you're missing a cell on a row or whether you're missing a row. So for debugging purposes, it really helps if you turn on the border, and then once you're done setting up the table and you're happy with it, if it doesn't have to have borders, you get rid of that attribute and the border disappears. A couple of quick examples here. The first one's got a border of 1 pixel. You can see what it's going to look like in the browser. If you crank up that to 8, it's going to look like a really thick border, and then crank it up to 15 and you've got yourself a very thick border. Alright, now how about doing that with CSS. Here's an example of how you can set up the border for your TD and TH elements, for example. Specify that it's solid as opposed to dashed, for example, or dotted. Set up the color and set up the thickness. And then of course you can set up the border for the entire table as well. So we were already used to doing this kind of styling with CSS. You can do styling for your table and your table elements, individual sub-elements as well. Cell padding and cell spacing, two more terms that are quite useful whenever you're creating tables. We're actually going to need these for our exercises this week. So let's see how cell padding and cell spacing work. They are attributes that are used with the table element only. Cell spacing is the amount of space held between the individual cells, specified in number of pixels, whereas cell padding is the amount of space held between the contents of the cell and the cell border. Okay, if you don't specify anything for the cell spacing, the browser will just use the default value of 2 pixels for the space between cells, and likewise if you don't specify any values for the cell padding, the cells will have the default value of 1 pixel of padding. And here's the way to change those two, cell padding and cell spacing. Here we set them to 4 pixels and 5 pixels respectively. And here's a visual example of how that changes the look of your table. So without any cell spacing, this is your regular table here that's got 2 items on the first row. However, if you set the cell spacing to 10, here's what the table is going to look like. So the distance between the individual table cells is going to go up from was it 2 to 10. As far as padding goes, without any cell padding, we got a default value of 1 pixel, and this is what your table is going to look like. But if you if you set the cell padding value to 10, then you'll end up with a distance of 10 pixels between your cell data and the border of the cell. So that's how cell spacing and cell padding work. And like I said, we're going to actually need these two for our exercise this week. One more really useful tool in customizing the way your tables work has to do with changing the span of individual cells. They can span multiple rows, or they can span multiple columns. And let's see how that actually works. Cell spanning can be horizontal or vertical, and it's done with the help of the col span or row span attributes. Col span indicates how many columns you want your data item to span, so how many columns it's going to occupy. Row span tells the browser how many rows you want your individual data item to span. And a table span can be extended horizontally with the col span attribute, so you go horizontally with that one. And if you use row span, you're spanning multiple rows, so you're extending your table cell vertically. Let's take a look at an example. So in this table we got 2 rows and 1, 2, 3 columns. However, our very first cell that we create is going to span both rows. So it's going to occupy rows 1 and 2, and the second cell that we create is supposed to span 2 columns, so it's going to take up columns 2 and 3. How do we do that? Here's the syntax. So we create our first row, and notice this: for our very first cell or very first data item that we have there, we set row span to equal 2. And that's how the browser knows that this exact cell should span 2 rows, and should be the first one on the second row as well. As we move on to the next cell, we can see it's defined with the col span equals 2 attribute. So that's how the browser is going to know this cell needs to span over 2 columns, which happen to be columns 2 and 3. We then move on to the next row. Since cell number 1 is already occupying the first column there, the 2 additional cells that we create are going to show up in columns 2 and 3. This is actually one of our one of our exercises this week, so it's an excellent thing to try and do on our own, and we're going to do this in the exercise. Another quick example here, a simpler one than the one before. We only have, what is it, 2 rows here, and the first row is going to be a heading, and we want that to span over both columns. So the way we accomplish that is with the call span attribute, set that to 2, and make sure that the data item is table heading instead of table data. 3 rows and 2 columns, yet another example. So starting with the first cell, we set the data item to have a row span of 3. That means this thing is going to go over our first 3 rows, which in this case is our entire table, because there are only 3 rows there. And then we create the other 3 data cells with the TD tags. One on the first row, one on the second row, and one on the third row. Using a table to format a web page, as we mentioned this earlier, this isn't as popular as it used to be. Today CSS is mostly used to set up the number of columns, rows, and the overall layout of your web page. We'll see how that's done. But here's an example of using a table to outline the elements of your entire web page. Border equals 0 will ensure that this table is not going to be visible. Width 80% means that we're going to force a margin of 10% on each side, the left and the right. So your table is going to occupy 80% of the visible space within the application where it's open. Okay, so if your browser is maximized and it's taking up your entire screen, your table is going to take up 80% of your entire screen. Then we create a row with a column span of 3. We're going to use that kind of like a banner. Right now that's actually displayed in there, a heading 2 saying banner. You can use whatever you want there, images, text, what have you. And then on the next row, our first cell is going to have a width of 20% of the overall space horizontally, and it's going to be vertically aligned with a value of top. Next one has a width of only 10 pixels, and it's got nothing in there. We just have one single non-breaking space, so we are using it kind of like a divider. And finally, we're going to place all of the content inside that final data cell. The width may be specified in pixels or percentage. And then for your table cells, some of the things you can customize are the horizontal alignment, the vertical alignment, top, middle, bottom, or the width. And here's the syntax to do it. So you do table width equals height equals, and that sets up the width and the height of your table. And to create a table whose height is equal to the entire height of the display area, you simply use 100% for the height. Do remember that if you specify an absolute size for a table in pixels, its size is going to remain constant. So, and that's regardless of the browser or the monitor settings used. This, on occasion, this actually may be helpful if you want to display something in there that should take up a certain amount of space and should not be squished or squashed in any way. But in a lot of cases, you may want to avoid that and just leave it up to the browser to decide how much space the table is going to take up. It's entirely up to you and the topic of whatever web page you're creating. The values of the align and the vertical align attributes, this is another thing that's part of our exercises this week, so please do note the information on this slide. If you need something to be displayed, say in the top left corner, you're going to set your horizontal alignment to left, your vertical alignment to top. If you want something, say near the right side but in the middle, your horizontal alignment is going to be equal to right, and your vertical alignment will be equal to middle. Okay, so take note of this particular slide. We're going to use this in our exercise. And finally, before we wrap it up, just one more example here, reminding you that you can set up your individual elements with a certain number of pixels, and so with that you can set a font size for the individual elements of your table. Okay, so each cell can have its own um, size defined in pixels. And with that, we wrap up our discussion on lists and tables. Thank you very much for watching.